Sarah Martinez stepped through the glass doors of Thomson Industries, clutching a worn leather portfolio against her chest. The receptionist barely glanced up from her computer screen, offering only a brief nod toward the elevator bank. Sarah's sneakers squeaked against the polished marble floor as she made her way across the vast lobby, feeling smaller with each step. At 23, Sarah had never imagined she would find herself in the headquarters of one of the country's largest manufacturing companies. 6 months ago, she had been working double shifts at a local diner, saving every penny to finish her engineering degree through night classes. The opportunity to intern at Thomson Industries had come through a community outreach program, designed to give underprivileged students a glimpse into corporate life. The elevator hummed quietly as it carried her to the 15th floor, where the engineering department sprawled across an entire level. Sarah's reflection in the polished steel doors showed a young woman with determined eyes but nervous hands. She had spent her last $50 on a professional outfit from a thrift store, hoping to make a good impression on her first day. When the doors opened, Sarah was greeted by the sight of dozens of engineers hunched over computer screens, their desks cluttered with technical manuals and coffee cups. The department buzzed with focused energy, and Sarah could hear fragments of conversations about production schedules, efficiency ratings, and cost analyses. "You must be the intern," came a voice from behind her. Sarah turned to see a tall man in his 50s, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed and his tie perfectly straight. "I'm Robert Chen, department supervisor. We've been expecting you." Robert's tone was polite but distant, the kind of courtesy extended to temporary visitors who wouldn't be around long enough to matter. As he led Sarah through the maze of cubicles, she noticed how the other engineers looked up briefly before returning to their work, already dismissing her presence. "Your workstation is over here," Robert said, stopping beside a small desk tucked into a corner near the copy machine. The space was clearly an afterthought, furnished with an older computer and a stack of outdated technical manuals. "You'll be assisting with data entry and basic administrative tasks. Nothing too complicated." Sarah nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. She had hoped for something more challenging, an opportunity to apply the engineering principles she had been studying so diligently. But she understood the reality of her situation. She was here on charity, a temporary presence in a world where she didn't belong. "The Wilson account files need to be digitized," Robert continued, pointing to several boxes of paper documents stacked beside her desk. "It's tedious work, but it needs to be done. Think you can handle that?" "Of course," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. She had not come this far to be defeated by data entry. Every opportunity was a stepping stone, and she was determined to make the most of whatever chance she was given. As Robert walked away, Sarah settled into her chair and opened the first box of files. The Wilson account, she learned from scanning the documents, was one of Thomson Industries' oldest and most problematic clients. For 10 years, they had been struggling with production inefficiencies at their main manufacturing plant, resulting in constant delays and cost overruns. The files painted a picture of mounting frustration. Engineer after engineer had been assigned to the Wilson account, each promising solutions that ultimately fell short. The company had invested millions in new equipment, hired expensive consultants, and implemented countless process improvements, yet the fundamental problems persisted. Sarah found herself drawn into the technical details as she digitized each document. Production reports showed consistent bottlenecks in the assembly line. Quality control data revealed patterns of defects that seemed to spike at certain times of day. Maintenance logs documented equipment failures that followed a peculiar rhythm, occurring most frequently during shift changes. Despite herself, Sarah began to see connections that others might have missed. Her background was different from the engineers around her. While they had learned their trade in prestigious universities, she had gained her knowledge through a combination of community college courses and hands-on experience at her previous jobs. She had worked in factories, understood the reality of production floors, and knew how equipment behaved under real-world conditions. As the hours passed, Sarah found herself making notes in the margins of her digitization log. She noticed correlations between production delays and specific environmental factors. She observed patterns in the data that seemed to point toward solutions the previous engineers had overlooked. By the end of her first day, Sarah had barely made a dent in the Wilson account files, but she had gained something more valuable than completed data entry. She had begun to understand the scope and complexity of a problem that had stumped Thomson Industries' best minds for a decade. Walking back through the lobby that evening, Sarah's footsteps echoed differently than they had that morning. She still felt like an outsider, still knew she was viewed as just another temporary intern, but something had shifted inside her. She had seen an opportunity hidden within those dusty files, a challenge that called to everything she had learned about engineering and problem solving. The security guard at the front desk nodded as she signed out, already forgetting her face before she had reached the revolving door. To everyone at Thomson Industries, Sarah Martinez was just another intern who would be gone in a few weeks, leaving barely a trace of her presence. They had no idea what she was capable of. They couldn't have imagined that within those boxes of seemingly routine files lay the foundation for something extraordinary. Sarah walked into the cool evening air, her mind already racing with possibilities, unaware that she was about to embark on a journey that would change not only her own life but the entire trajectory of Thomson Industries. The Wilson account had defeated seasoned engineers for 10 years. Tomorrow, Sarah would begin to understand why, and, in understanding, she would find the key to something remarkable. 3 weeks into her internship, Sarah had established a quiet routine that went unnoticed by her colleagues. She arrived early each morning, before the engineering department came alive with the daily rush of meetings and deadlines. In those peaceful hours, she continued her work on the Wilson account files, but her approach had evolved far beyond simple data entry. Sarah had begun creating her own database, not just digitizing the documents but analyzing and cross-referencing the information in ways that revealed hidden patterns. She worked with the determination of someone who understood that opportunities like this might never come again, staying late into the evening long after the other engineers had gone home. Her breakthrough came on a Tuesday night, when most of the building had emptied except for the security staff and a few dedicated workaholics. Sarah was deep in the production data from Wilson's third-quarter reports when something clicked. The pattern she had been sensing for weeks suddenly became crystal clear. The production delays weren't random. They followed a specific sequence related to the interaction between Wilson's aging machinery and their newer automated systems. Every previous engineer had focused on either the old equipment or the new technology, treating them as separate problems. But Sarah could see they were connected in ways no one had considered. She pulled up the maintenance schedules and compared them with production output data. The correlation was undeniable. Every time Wilson's facility performed routine maintenance on their legacy machinery, it created cascading effects throughout their modernized production line. The two systems were fighting each other, creating inefficiencies that compounded over time. Sarah's heart raced as she verified her findings again and again. She had discovered something significant, something that could potentially solve Wilson Industries' decade-long struggle. But she also understood her position. She was an intern, barely 3 weeks into a program that most people viewed as charity work. Who would listen to her? The next morning, Sarah watched Robert Chen arrive at his usual time, greeting the senior engineers with easy familiarity. She had prepared a summary of her findings, printing it out on paper she had purchased herself since she wasn't sure if interns were allowed to use the office printer for personal projects. "Mr. Chen," Sarah said, approaching his office door during what she hoped was a quiet moment. "Could I speak with you about the Wilson account?" Robert looked up from his computer with mild surprise. "Is there a problem with the data entry? Are the files damaged?" "No, sir. The files are fine. But I think I've found something important in the production data. Something that might help solve their efficiency problems." Robert's expression shifted from surprise to gentle amusement. "Sarah, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but the Wilson account is incredibly complex. Our senior engineers have been working on those problems for years. I don't think—" "I know how it sounds," Sarah interrupted, then immediately regretted being so forward. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. But could you just look at this? Please?" Something in Sarah's voice, a combination of desperation and absolute conviction, made Robert pause. He had been managing engineers for 2 decades, and he recognized the tone of someone who had discovered something real. Against his better judgment, he gestured for Sarah to sit down. Sarah spread her handwritten analysis across Robert's desk, her voice gaining strength as she explained her findings. She showed him the correlations between maintenance schedules and production delays, demonstrated how the legacy and modern systems were creating interference patterns, and outlined a potential solution that could address both problems simultaneously. As Sarah talked, Robert's expression gradually changed from polite attention to genuine interest, and, finally, to something approaching amazement. He had seen these same data sets countless times, had supervised multiple teams of experienced engineers who had analyzed every aspect of Wilson's operations. Yet here was an intern, barely out of community college, presenting insights that none of them had considered. "How did you?" Robert began, then stopped himself. "Where did you learn to analyze data like this?" Sarah hesitated, suddenly, aware of how different her background was from everyone else in the department. "I worked in manufacturing before I went back to school. I've seen how old and new equipment can conflict when companies try to modernize without considering the whole system. And the math. I've been studying systems analysis in my night classes." Robert studied the papers again, checking Sarah's calculations and reviewing her methodology. Everything was sound. More than sound, it was brilliant. "Sarah, do you understand what you found here?" "I think so," Sarah replied carefully. "If I'm right, Wilson Industries could increase their production efficiency by approximately 30% just by changing how they schedule maintenance and calibrating the interface between their old and new systems. It wouldn't require any major equipment purchases." Robert leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the implications. The Wilson account was worth millions to Thomson Industries, but it had also been a source of constant frustration. If Sarah's analysis was correct, it could transform their relationship with Wilson and establish Thomson as the industry leader in efficiency consulting. But there was a problem. Sarah was an intern, a temporary employee with no official credentials within the company. If her solution worked, how could Thomson Industries present it? How could they explain that their breakthrough had come from someone who wasn't even a real employee? "Sarah," Robert said finally, "I need you to not discuss this with anyone else." "Not yet. Give me some time to figure out how to handle this properly." Sarah nodded, understanding more than Robert realized. She knew that her discovery had created a complicated situation. In the corporate world, credit and credibility were carefully guarded commodities. Her background and status made her an unlikely candidate for recognition, regardless of the quality of her work. Over the next few days, Sarah watched as Robert quietly consulted with senior engineers about her findings. She saw them reviewing her analysis, checking her calculations, and gradually accepting that her conclusions were correct. But she also sensed the growing tension around how to proceed. The breakthrough that should have been a moment of triumph instead became a source of anxiety. Sarah had proven that she belonged in this world of engineering and problem-solving, but she had done so from a position that made it difficult for the company to acknowledge her contribution. As the whispers spread through the engineering department, Sarah realized that her discovery had set in motion a series of events that would test not only her technical abilities but also her courage and determination. She had shown what she was capable of, but now she would have to fight for the opportunity to see her solution implemented. The Wilson account files sat on her desk, no longer just documents to be digitized but evidence of a breakthrough that could change everything. Sarah had moved beyond being just a visitor in the world of engineering. She had become someone with something valuable to offer, and now she would discover whether Thomson Industries was ready to listen. The conference room on the 16th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city, but Sarah kept her eyes focused on the polished table in front of her. Around that table sat 8 senior engineers, 3 department managers, and the vice president of operations, all of them studying copies of her analysis with expressions ranging from skeptical to cautiously intrigued. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah's conversation with Robert Chan, 2 weeks during which her findings had been quietly vetted, verified, and elevated through Thomson Industries' hierarchy. Now, on a gray Thursday morning, she found herself in the most important meeting of her life, about to present her solution to people who had the power to implement it. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert began, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. As you know, the Wilson account has been our most challenging client for the past decade. Every approach we've tried has yielded marginal improvements at best. Today, we're going to hear a completely different perspective on the problem. Sarah felt the weight of 20 pairs of eyes as Robert introduced her. She could sense the skepticism in the room, the barely concealed doubt about why an intern was addressing such a high-level meeting. But she also remembered the countless nights she had spent analyzing data while her classmates were sleeping, the years of working multiple jobs while pursuing her education, the determination that had brought her to this moment. "Thank you for this opportunity," Sarah began, her voice steadier than she had expected. "I know my presence here is unusual, but I believe the Wilson account requires an unusual approach." She walked them through her findings methodically, explaining how she had discovered the hidden relationship between Wilson's maintenance schedules and production inefficiencies. As she spoke, Sarah noticed the subtle changes in body language around the table. The initial skepticism was giving way to attention, then to genuine interest. "The key insight," Sarah continued, pointing to a chart she had prepared, "is that Wilson Industries has been treating their legacy and modern systems as separate entities. Every efficiency improvement they've implemented has optimized one system while inadvertently creating conflicts with the other." Margaret Foster, the vice president of operations, leaned forward. "Our consulting team spent 6 months on site at Wilson's facility last year. They mapped every process, analyzed every workflow. How did they miss this?" Sarah had anticipated this question, but it still made her nervous. She was essentially being asked to explain why experienced engineers had overlooked something she had discovered from a desk in the corner of the office. "I think it's because everyone who worked on Wilson's problems was looking for complex solutions," Sarah replied carefully. "The production delays, the quality control issues, the equipment failures, they all seemed like separate problems requiring different expertise. But, when you look at the timing patterns, you see they're all connected to the same root cause." Dr. James Patterson, the most senior engineer in the department, spoke up. "Even if your analysis is correct, implementing this solution would require Wilson to completely restructure their maintenance protocols. That's a massive undertaking for a company that's already struggling with efficiency." "Actually," Sarah said, surprised by her own confidence, "the implementation would be much simpler than previous approaches. Instead of replacing equipment or overhauling their entire production line, Wilson would just need to modify their scheduling software and recalibrate the interfaces between their systems. The total cost would be less than 10% of what they've already spent on failed solutions." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Sarah was right, Thomson Industries could deliver a transformative solution to their most challenging client at a fraction of the cost of previous attempts. The potential impact on both companies would be enormous. Margaret Foster exchanged glances with the other executives before speaking. "Sarah, your analysis is impressive, but before we can move forward, we need to address some practical concerns. How do we present this solution to Wilson Industries? How do we explain that our breakthrough came from?" She paused, searching for the right words. From an intern, Sarah finished for her, understanding the subtext. Someone without credentials or official standing in the company. The uncomfortable silence that followed confirmed Sarah's suspicions. Her discovery was valuable enough to capture the attention of Thomson Industries' top executives, but her status as an intern created complications that no one knew how to handle. Robert Chen shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Perhaps we could present this as a collaborative effort, with Sarah working under the guidance of our senior engineering team. Or, Dr. Patterson suggested, we could develop the presentation internally, using Sarah's insights as a foundation but framing the solution within our established consulting methodology." Sarah listened to the discussion with growing unease. She understood the business realities that were driving these conversations, but she also recognized that her contribution was being systematically minimized. The solution that could revolutionize Wilson Industries' operations was being repackaged to fit corporate expectations about who deserved credit for innovation. "Excuse me," Sarah said, interrupting the debate around the table. "I understand the challenges my status creates, but I have a question. If my analysis is implemented and it works, if Wilson Industries achieves the efficiency improvements I projected, what happens next? Do I go back to data entry? Do I finish my internship and disappear? Margaret Foster looked at Sarah with new interest. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that if Thomson Industries is going to present my solution to Wilson, then I should be part of that presentation. Not as an intern who got lucky, but as someone who understood this problem better than anyone else who's worked on it. The audacity of Sarah's statement sent a ripple of shock through the room. Interns didn't make demands. They didn't negotiate for recognition or push back against corporate hierarchies. But Sarah had moved beyond the limitations of her official title. She had become someone with leverage, and she was finally ready to use it. Dr. Patterson frowned. Sarah, you have to understand the position you're putting us in. Wilson Industries expects to work with experienced professionals. They're not going to accept recommendations from someone who's barely out of school. Then, maybe it's time for Wilson Industries to reconsider their expectations, Sarah replied. Because the experienced professionals haven't solved their problem. I have. The tension in the room was palpable as Sarah's words hung in the air. She had crossed a line, challenging not just corporate protocol but the fundamental assumptions about expertise and authority that govern Thomson Industries' relationship with their clients. Margaret Foster studied Sarah's face, seeing something that reminded her of her own younger self, back when she had fought for recognition in a male-dominated industry. What exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that I present my solution to Wilson Industries myself, Sarah said. With support from the team, but as the lead engineer on this project. If it works, Wilson gets their efficiency improvements, Thomson Industries gets credit for solving an impossible problem, and I get the opportunity to prove that I belong here. And if it doesn't work? Dr. Patterson asked. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. Then, I take full responsibility for the failure, and Thomson Industries can honestly say they gave an innovative approach a chance. The room fell silent again as the executives considered Sarah's proposal. She had transformed the meeting from a discussion about how to use her discovery to a negotiation about her future with the company. It was a bold move, one that could either launch her career or end it before it had truly begun. Margaret Foster looked around the table, reading the expressions of her colleagues before making a decision that would change everything. All right, Sarah. Let's see what you can do. The Wilson Industries manufacturing facility sprawled across 40 acres of industrial landscape, its aging brick buildings connected by newer steel and glass structures that told the story of a company caught between its past and its future. Sarah stood at the entrance to the main production hall, wearing a hard hat that felt too large for her head and carrying a briefcase that contained what might be the most important presentation of her career. Beside her, Robert Chen checked his watch nervously. Remember, Sarah, Charles Wilson built this company from the ground up. He's not easily impressed, and he's lost patience with consultants who make big promises they can't deliver. You'll have maybe 15 minutes to capture his attention before he decides whether to listen to your proposal or end the meeting. Sarah nodded, her mouth dry despite the humid air of the production floor. 3 days had passed since Margaret Foster had approved her unprecedented request to lead the presentation to Wilson Industries. 3 days of intensive preparation, during which Thomson Industries senior engineers had scrutinized every aspect of her analysis, testing her conclusions and preparing for every possible objection. The factory floor buzzed with activity, but Sarah could see the inefficiencies she had identified in her analysis playing out in real time. Workers clustered around machinery that had stopped unexpectedly, supervisors consulted clipboards while production lines sat idle, and the rhythmic sounds of manufacturing were punctuated by the occasional alarm or shout of frustration. Charles Wilson appeared through the maze of equipment like a man accustomed to moving through his domain with purpose. At 62, he had the weathered hands of someone who had built his business from the factory floor up, but his eyes carried the sharp intelligence of a successful entrepreneur. Behind him walked his production manager, Helen Rodriguez, and their head of engineering, David Kim, both of whom Sarah recognized from the technical reports she had studied. Mr. Chen, Charles said, shaking Robert's hand with a firm grip. I have to admit, I'm curious about this breakthrough you mentioned. We've heard a lot of promises over the years. Robert gestured toward Sarah. Charles, I'd like you to meet Sarah Martinez, the engineer who developed the analysis we discussed. She'll be presenting our recommendations today. Sarah watched Charles Wilson's expression shift as he processed Robert's introduction. She could see him taking in her age, her appearance, the obvious fact that she was not the seasoned consultant he had been expecting. For a moment, she thought he might end the meeting before it began. Instead, Charles extended his hand to Sarah with genuine courtesy. Ms. Martinez, welcome to Wilson Industries. I understand you think you found something my engineers have missed? I believe I've identified why your efficiency problems have persisted despite all the improvements you've implemented, Sarah replied, grateful that her voice remained steady. And I think I can show you how to solve them without any major capital investments. Charles raised an eyebrow. That would be quite an accomplishment. Shall we adjourn to the conference room? The conference room overlooked the main production floor through a wall of windows, providing a perfect view of the operations Sarah had been analyzing for weeks through data and reports. As Charles and his team settled around the table, Sarah connected her laptop to the room's projection system and took a deep breath. For the past 10 years, Sarah began, Wilson Industries has been fighting what everyone assumed were separate problems: production delays, quality control issues, and equipment reliability concerns. Every solution has targeted these problems individually, which is why they've only achieved limited success. She clicked to her first slide, which showed a timeline of Wilson's efficiency initiatives overlaid with their actual production data. But, when you analyze the timing patterns, you discover that all of these problems stem from a single source: the interaction between your legacy manufacturing systems and your modernized production line. David Kim, Wilson's head of engineer, leaned forward with interest. We've looked at that interface extensively. Our systems are properly integrated. They're connected, Sarah agreed, but they're not optimized to work together. Your legacy machinery operates on mechanical rhythms that were established decades ago, while your modern equipment follows digital protocols that prioritize speed and precision. When these systems interact, especially during maintenance cycles, they create cascading conflicts throughout your entire production process. Sarah walked them through her analysis step by step, showing how Wilson's maintenance schedules inadvertently synchronized the conflicts between old and new systems. She demonstrated how seemingly random production delays actually followed predictable patterns related to these interactions, and how quality control problems spiked whenever the two systems were forced to operate out of harmony. As she spoke, Sarah could see the moment when understanding dawned in each person's eyes. Charles Wilson sat back in his chair, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement. Helen Rodriguez began taking rapid notes, already thinking through the implementation implications. Even David Kim, who had initially seemed defensive about Sarah's critique of his systems, was nodding as he recognized the patterns she described. The solution, Sarah continued, clicking to her final set of slides, doesn't require new equipment or major system overhauls. Instead, we need to restructure your maintenance schedules and recalibrate the interfaces between your legacy and modern systems to work in harmony rather than in conflict. She outlined an implementation plan that could be executed in phases, minimizing disruption to current operations while delivering measurable improvements within the first month. The total cost would be less than Wilson Industries typically spent on routine equipment upgrades, but the projected efficiency gains were substantial. According to my calculations, Sarah concluded, these modifications should increase your overall production efficiency by 30 to 35%, reduce unplanned downtime by approximately 60%, and improve quality control metrics across all product lines. The conference room fell silent as the implications of Sarah's presentation sank in. Charles Wilson stared at the projection screen, where Sarah's final slide showed a comparison between Wilson Industries' current performance metrics and the projected improvements. Ms. Martinez, Charles said finally, are you telling me that the solution to problems that have cost my company millions of dollars and years of frustration is essentially a scheduling adjustment? Sarah met his gaze directly. I'm telling you that the solution is understanding that your problems aren't separate issues requiring different fixes. They're symptoms of a single underlying conflict that can be resolved by treating your facility as an integrated system rather than a collection of independent components.
Helen Rodriguez looked up from her notes. How confident are you in these projections?
Confident enough to recommend a pilot implementation, Sarah replied. We could start with one production line, implement the scheduling and calibration changes, and measure the results. If the improvements match my projections, we expand to the rest of the facility. If they don't, Wilson Industries has lost nothing but a few weeks of testing. Charles Wilson stood and walked to the windows overlooking his production floor. Sarah watched as he surveyed the operation that represented his life's work, the company he had built from a small machine shop into one of the region's major manufacturers. She understood that her proposal represented more than just operational improvements, it offered Wilson Industries a path forward that honored both their heritage and their future.
Mr. Chen, Charles said, turning back to the table, how soon can we begin this pilot program?
Robert Chen glanced at Sarah, recognizing that the moment had arrived for the final, crucial decision.
Sarah would need to be on site to oversee the implementation personally. Are you comfortable working with her as the lead engineer on this project? Charles Wilson looked at Sarah with new respect. Ms. Martinez, 3 hours ago I thought I was meeting with Thomson Industries to hear another expensive proposal for problems we might never solve. Instead, I find myself convinced that a young engineer has understood my business better than anyone I've worked with in years. He paused, considering his next words carefully. Yes, I'm comfortable working with her. In fact, I insist on it. This is her solution, and I want her to be the one who implements it. As Sarah shook hands with Charles Wilson and his team, she realized that everything had changed. She was no longer an intern hoping for a chance to prove herself. She had become an engineer with a solution, a professional with credibility, and a person whose ideas would shape the future of two companies. The 10-year record of failure that had defined the Wilson account was about to be broken, and Sarah Martinez would be the one to break it. But, first, she would have to prove that her theories could work in the real world of manufacturing, where equipment failures and production deadlines left no room for miscalculation. 6 weeks later, Sarah stood in the same conference room at Wilson Industries, but everything else had changed. The windows that had once looked out on a production floor marked by inefficiency and frustration now revealed a facility operating with precision and rhythm that Charles Wilson hadn't seen in over a decade. The numbers on Sarah's laptop screen told a story that exceeded even her most optimistic projections. Production efficiency had increased by 38%. Unplanned downtime had been reduced by 71%. Quality control metrics showed the most consistent performance in Wilson Industries history. The pilot program that had started with a single production line had been expanded to cover the entire facility, and every metric confirmed that Sarah's solution was not just working, it was revolutionary. Around the conference table sat the same group that had listened to her initial presentation, but their expressions reflected a transformation that went far beyond operational improvements. Charles Wilson wore the satisfied smile of a man whose faith in innovation had been validated. Helen Rodriguez had pages of notes documenting improvements they were already planning to implement in other facilities. David Kim, who had initially been skeptical of Sarah's analysis, was now her strongest advocate within Wilson Industries. But the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The nervous intern who had clutched a worn leather portfolio had been replaced by a confident engineer who had proven her theories in the most demanding environment possible, the real world of manufacturing. Ladies and gentlemen, Charles Wilson began, his voice carrying the weight of someone announcing momentous news. In 47 years of running this company, I have never seen results like these. Ms. Martinez hasn't just solved our efficiency problems, she's given us capabilities we never thought possible. Robert Chen nodded in agreement. Sarah's solution has established a new benchmark for industrial consulting. Word is already spreading through the industry about what we've accomplished here. Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with humility. The success at Wilson Industries had indeed become a sensation in manufacturing circles. Trade publications were requesting interviews. Other companies were calling Thomson Industries, hoping to engage the engineer who had solved the impossible problem. Sarah's phone had been ringing constantly with job offers from competitors who wanted to recruit the talent that had achieved such unprecedented results. There's something else we need to discuss, Charles Wilson continued, his tone becoming more serious.
Sarah, your contract with Thompson Industries expires next month.
Helen and I have been talking, and we'd like to make you an offer.
Sarah glanced at Robert, who nodded encouragingly. They had discussed this possibility as Wilson Industries' results continued to exceed expectations. Sarah had proven herself not just as an engineer but as someone who could deliver transformational solutions to the most challenging problems. We want to offer you a position as our Director of Process Innovation, Helen Rodriguez said. It would involve working with our facilities around the country, applying the same systematic approach that has been so successful here. The salary would be competitive with what senior engineers earn at major consulting firms.
The offer was everything Sarah could have hoped for when she first walked through the doors of Thompson Industries as an uncertain intern.
Director-level responsibility, the opportunity to work on complex engineering challenges, and financial security that would allow her to focus entirely on what she loved without worrying about paying for school or supporting herself through multiple jobs. But, as Sarah considered the offer, she realized that her ambitions had evolved along with her capabilities. The success at Wilson Industries had shown her that she could do more than solve individual problems. She could change how entire industries approached efficiency and innovation.
Charles, Helen, I'm honored by your offer, Sarah said carefully, but I think I have a different path in mind.
She looked around the room at the faces that had become familiar over the past 6 weeks, people who had watched her grow from an uncertain intern into a respected professional. I want to start my own consulting firm, focusing on the kind of systematic analysis that we've proven successful here. There are hundreds of companies struggling with the same kinds of problems Wilson Industries faced, and I believe we've developed an approach that can help them.
The room fell silent as everyone processed Sarah's announcement.
Starting her own company was an enormous leap, one that would require her to find clients, manage business operations, and build credibility in a competitive market.
Robert Chen was the first to speak. Sarah, that's incredibly ambitious. Do you have the resources to launch a consulting firm?
Actually, Charles Wilson interjected, I think I can help with that. Wilson Industries would be very interested in becoming the first client of Martinez Process Solutions, or whatever you decide to call your company. We have 3 other facilities that could benefit from your approach, and I know several other manufacturers who would be eager to work with the engineer who solved our problems.
Sarah felt her heart racing as the possibilities took shape.
Charles Wilson's endorsement would provide both the credibility and the initial client base she would need to launch her own firm. The success at Wilson Industries had given her something more valuable than a job. It had given her the foundation for a career built on her own terms.
There's one more thing, Sarah said, looking directly at Robert Chen. I'd like Thompson Industries to be my first business partner, not my former employer. You took a chance on me when no one else would have. I'd like to work together on projects that require both your established reputation and my systematic approach. Margaret Foster, who had been quietly observing the conversation, smiled at Sarah's proposal. I think Thompson Industries would be very interested in that kind of partnership.
You've proven that innovation can come from unexpected places, and we want to be part of what you do next. As the meeting concluded and handshakes were exchanged, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been working double shifts at a diner, hoping for a chance to prove that she belonged in the world of engineering. Today, she was launching her own company with the support of clients who had seen firsthand what she was capable of achieving. The 10-year record of failure that had defined the Wilson account was not just broken, it had been obliterated. But, more importantly, Sarah had established herself as someone who could see solutions where others saw only problems, someone who could transform entire industries through the power of systematic thinking and relentless determination. Walking through the Wilson Industries facility that evening, Sarah watched the production lines operating with the efficiency and precision that her solution had made possible.
Workers moved with confidence, knowing that the equipment would perform reliably. Supervisors focused on optimization rather than crisis management.
The entire facility hummed with the satisfaction of systems working in harmony.
Charles Wilson joined her on the factory floor, surveying the operation that now represented the pinnacle of manufacturing efficiency.
You know, Sarah, when Robert first told me about a young intern who thought she could solve our problems, I almost canceled the meeting.
I'm glad I didn't.
Sarah smiled, remembering her own doubts on that first day at Thompson Industries.
I'm glad you gave me a chance to try.
You didn't just try, Charles replied. You succeeded beyond anyone's imagination.
And, from what I hear, you're just getting started. As Sarah left Wilson Industries that evening, her reflection in the glass doors showed a young woman transformed.
The uncertain intern was gone, replaced by someone who had proven that determination, intelligence, and systematic thinking could overcome any obstacle. She had broken more than just a 10-year record, she had broken through the barriers that separated her from her dreams. Tomorrow, Sarah Martinez would begin building her own company, armed with the knowledge that she could accomplish anything she set her mind to achieve. The world of engineering would never be quite the same, and Sarah wouldn't have it any other way.